Welcome back to Cloud Wars Live. The digital revolution is in full swing. It is a pleasure and an honor to try to chronicle it, understand it, and share some thoughts with you about where this is headed and why and where it might be going. So one of our favorite guests here on Cloud Wars Live is Tony Uphoff. Tony's been a CEO at 4 different organizations. He's helping business leaders, venture capitalists, and others try to figure out the way forward in these crazy times. And Tony's brings a wealth of experience in technology and related fields, and being a chief executive sitting at top organizations, most recently went through a big digital transformation. Tony, welcome back. It's always great to see you.
Hey, Bob, great to see you. And thanks for having me on as usual.
Yeah. Well, of course. And Tony, you know, it's fun. I always enjoy the conversations, partly because you prod me to think about things in some different ways. But you know, this the industry cloud phenomenon, I think we've called it some here. It's not just coming up and becoming an interesting little category or laying over on the side. I get the sense that it is banging into and disrupting a lot of things up and down the line. So I know you had some thoughts on that.
You know, Bob, if you look at what's happening, and certainly, you know, the headline might be vertical cloud, and we could give a lot of examples. Your listeners would certainly know most of them, but all of the major cloud companies are taking vertical approaches, and it's starting to really accelerate. But I think something far bigger than just a go-to-market strategy is happening here. And I think it's actually rearranging the entire marketplace and industry itself. If you think about it, right, software particularly is now starting to move from a functional approach, i.e., I have a CRM problem, or I have a financial challenge that I need to automate, or a billing issue. Those are functional things. And while that's not going to go away, what you're starting to see is a fairly rapid shift towards companies saying, hey, I have a business problem, and it would be nice if I could automate one of my functions along with it, but I really want to accelerate my company or business. So I think that's leading, Bob, this shift from kind of a functional view to much more of an industry view. And the examples are all over the place, right? You know, you're starting to see the major tech companies, you know, starting to, through acquisition, certainly Amazon and Oracle have done this, start to step into some of these market, you know, like healthcare. If you look at some of the partnering that Google is doing around the manufacturing arena, where they're co-creating value with some of these companies. And I think where I'm going is in talking to venture capital firms, private equity firms, spending a tremendous amount of time at our Cloud Wars Expo event recently with, you know, buyers, chief information officers, and enterprise tech folks on both sides, the buy and sell side of things. Boy, you just keep hearing this over and over, that something new is happening. And I think the reason it's such a fruitful topic, Bob, is, you know, if this goes the direction it appears to be going, it's going to change everything. So, you know, if you're sitting there as a seller of technology and you think, oh, you know, big deal. So it's a vertical market. You know, hey, we've got a manufacturing practice too. It's gone much deeper than that. And I think it's going to impact channels of distribution. It's going to impact go-to-market strategy. But I think, Bob, it's entirely possible it's going to start to change organizational structure within some of the tech companies, as well as some of the companies who are using this technology to transform their businesses.
Yeah, Tony, great points there. And I think one of the reasons why, you know, lots of folks have been eager to talk with you, both on what you've done on your own as an acceleration economy analyst, as you bring a pretty good understanding of the technology business, but also as a CEO practitioner who's lived through some of these things. So I was really intrigued there by, you know, all of what you said, but in your final point, you said it's going to change everything. So could you just, you know, enumerate a few of the big impact things that people ought to be looking for, maybe give them a chance to get out in front of a couple of these things?
Yeah. If you think about this as, you know, I always try to differentiate when I see a market trend. Is this a pendulum swinging? You know, it was here and now it's swinging back over here, or is this a trend line? Fundamentally, is this the changing of something? As you and I have through 25 years, seen a lot of market transitions. Some perhaps was a head fake, and we thought, oh my gosh, everything's running over here. And it turned out it wasn't quite that. This, I think, is a trend line that is fundamentally changing things. So I'll give you a couple of examples here. If you think about historically in technology, particularly enterprise technology, the questions that would be asked, whether that's starting at the boardroom or down into the technology departments or engagements with vendors, would tend to be around which one or which ones do we evaluate? Terms like short list. Gee, we need a Gartner quadrant, and we need some things to kind of sort through the available options because, gee, we need a CRM system, or we need a cloud provider, or we need this, or we need that. What I'm hearing now is much more, how do I? So how do I solve this business problem? And again, the decision on the technology doesn't go away, but it puts it in a very different framework. Yeah. And so I think that's a shift, Bob, that, again, I was joking with you before we went on camera here that it seems kind of Forrest Gumpian in its simplicity, but oftentimes market transitions are. Yeah. They're so obvious. They're happening before your very eyes. And then you wake up and you go, oh, I should have paid attention to this. So I think that idea of, leading with how is this going to impact, or how will it solve my business problem, is the big shift. So what might change as we watch this play out, Bob? Well, I would point to one of the stories that you've been following, which was the multi-cloud joint announcement between Microsoft and Oracle. Yeah. Let me be blunt, and I hope I don't offend any of our friends at Microsoft or Oracle, but 10 years ago, no one, and I mean no one, would have started a sentence saying, hey, you know who's a great partner? Either one of those companies, right? And I say that with respect. These are, tough companies that have scaled and been hyper aggressive and built remarkable, brands and franchises and businesses that are just astounding. Now, all of a sudden, to watch them start to say, wait a second, there is something changing here. We need to partner and co-opetition, with each other and find a way. But it's 100% focused on solving customer problems and industry issues. It's not, hey, you have SQL and we have this over here, ipso facto, boy. Yeah. We put these two together. Hey, buddy, we'll go out to the marketplace and generate another $1 billion in revenue. And I think that's really a great example. I think the next one too that I would point to is, and we've seen all kinds of great vertical cloud announcements and strategies, and you've chronicled so many of them, Bob. I think the other thing is we're starting to see companies really start to surface complex, thorny business issues that technology has the opportunity to help transform. I give a good example at Cloud Wars Expo. You did a phenomenal interview, and I'll let you, if you don't mind, illuminate his name because I'll probably butcher it. But it was one of the professors from the Haas Berkeley School of Business, and he was talking about the concept that today in business, and we're seeing this play out in the supply chain, the days of having marketing drive demand in isolation and operations fulfill on that demand simply doesn't work anymore. Yeah. Business has gotten too complex. Things are moving too quickly. Supply chain is a 24-hour-a-day thrill ride of understanding what's happening there, as is demand, by the way. He introduced me, at least in that conversation, to the term demand distortion events. Uh-huh. And I had been struggling to articulate what we had seen happen during and post, hopefully, the COVID pandemic, because, demand, surged in areas that frankly were in very mature industries. And then post-COVID, you saw demand start to move around a little bit, both up and down in areas that I think would have been very difficult to predict. So my point I'm making on the impact that this vertical approach and industry approach to technology is also going to change. I think you're going to see two things. I think you're going to see a lot of enterprises are going to start, if they haven't already, start to rethink how those silos operate and how literally they're organized internally, because we can no longer just, throw demand over the wall and hope it sorts itself out on the supply chain side of things. In some respects, supply chain is going to need to go first, and we're going to need to create the flywheel that way. I think the other, and I would point to your conversation and analysis of Julia White's role at SAP. And I don't know if a lot of people really grasped the point you were making, which is a very subtle point. If you look at her title and you look at it quickly, you think she is, quote unquote, the CMO of the company. That's actually not the case. That is a part of what she does, but she also has control over some other things. So two main points I'm making here, Bob, that I think, in addition to the industry partnerships, I think we'll see that accelerate. And they're going to be business led. I think organizations are going to adapt and shift in terms of inside the enterprise. And then I think on the vendor side, I think the example of SAP is going to start to accelerate too. I think you're going to see some reorganization of duties, and not just in a symbolic title-based way. I mean, in a real functional operational framework there. And I think those are kind of three things, Bob, that hit me, that this trend is probably, as it accelerates, that's what's probably going to play out.
Yeah, Tony. And if I could add a fourth to that, because I really love where you're going with this, it would be the sort of the new kids at the decision-making table. So those organizational changes that you described surface new leaders or somebody who is leading not just this team, but also this team in some way, but new senses of responsibility. And I think some of these new leaders, Tony, who are now having voices in the discussion about what are the challenges we take on first, what do we give priority to, what are we trying to solve here, and then which technologies do we bring in to address this? They don't have 5 or 10 or 20 years history with Microsoft and Oracle.
Such a good point.
And Microsoft. They just say, from today forward, who's
such a good
the best
point
thing to get, as opposed to, some people might say, well, we're a XYZ shop, or we're a this, that. And that was fine at one point, but I don't think so. So, Tony, and you think about, like you said, with the magnitude of the Ellison-Nadella conversation, which we're going to talk about some, in upcoming or in a recent Cloud Wars Minute and article. Both of them got up, and in a fairly short period of time, they talked about this whole future of multi-cloud, but they talked about it through the eyes of the customer. It'll make this easier.
Yep.
It'll make this easier. It'll help with this. And I think in addition to those things of getting it easier, part of it was a public declaration of saying, hey, we realize there's been a shift here. The balance of power in the tech industry between buyers and sellers, it has gone totally over to the buyers. And I think it was sort of an acknowledgement saying, we're going to make multi-cloud easy, not because we're going to throw you a bone, but because we know that this is the coming expectation. And if you don't make this happen, vendor XYZ, it doesn't matter all the other stuff you're doing, because the multi-cloud is the world they live in. So, Tony, I thought it was really refreshing to see the level of new type of conversation that Ellison and Nadella were having. And it was very upbeat, very optimistic. And so, like you said, if you think back, it wouldn't have been that, well, even today, right? I suspect there are Microsoft sales teams and Oracle sales teams clawing each other's eyes out for a big infrastructure, an application, a database. But yet, because of the customers now being at the top of the pyramid, they're also saying, but we'll play together where that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, and I think, Bob, two things. I think your point of new and or different decision makers gathering around the table today inside companies, I think is huge. There's both generational dynamics there at play as the millennial generation becomes a massive decision-making body inside businesses. And that's a piece of it. But I also think, it's fascinating not to go too macro in the conversation, but we're also witnessing a bit of a reevaluation of traditional gatekeepers, whether those traditional gatekeepers were media brands or, analyst companies or whoever it might be. I think there's a higher level of scrutiny, if not, kind of, hey, tell me something I don't know, and or, help me with this problem. I know you have a quadrant or a box you're going to try to sell me, but you know what? I've got a problem over here. And I think those things are coming together. And I think part of this is, it's always that famous chicken or the egg. You and I have debated this for years. Have we witnessed such a massive shift in the way technology is enabling things that's what's happening? Or is this a cultural and societal shift, and that's driving some of these technological changes? We could spend the rest of our lives debating that. But I think what is fascinating to me is at the end of the day, and you really nailed this, I think we've come through an era where the vendor has controlled so much of the outcome. You're going to take this because this is what's available, right? And I think the smart vendors have realized, boy, this is at the end of the day a version of software. We can customize this based on solving business challenges. And so I think there's a really interesting, again, I'm not trying to say anything other than customers are in the driver's seat today. And I think who really wins is not just that customer. I think the smart technology companies win in a customer-centric view of the world if they can, co-create with that customer and get in sync with that customer. And obviously the results of some of the companies that we mentioned would indicate they've figured out how to do that.
Yeah. Well, Tony, sort of closing the loop on that, the speaker at Cloud Wars Expo that you referenced before was Professor Lu Yi Yang from the Uphoff School at Berkeley. Yeah. And when he was talking about supply chain, that's his area of specialization. I asked him about the demand chain thing and when he brought up, as you described, well, you got operations run supply chain. And he said it's not surprising that there's a lack of cohesion here because operations runs supply chain, but marketing runs demand chain. And he sort of dropped it. Like, well, isn't that obvious? And I was thinking, well, wait a minute, don't they work for the same company? If it's right there, why don't they get this? And he said, well, it's cultural, it's procedural, it's, there's probably some things in bonus provisions and all. But so you've laid out just a moment ago a great case for where the tech vendors have to be smarter. And I think at the same time, with your CEO hat on, you could say it's also time for the CEOs to address these areas inside their organizations where it's not so much you've got departments warring with each other, but maybe passive aggressively battling by not coming together. So you have these things like, well, operations does this and marketing does this and never the two shall meet. That's crazy.
Well, and Bob, your point, I think as the professor noted, and as you're noting, when you pull the thread on this, having come into different companies where I've been fortunate enough to have the opportunity to come in and see if we could get things rearranged and get the company back into growth. Oftentimes what you find is exactly what you described. You start to pull on a thread and you realize, perhaps organizationally, structure-wise, the company wasn't structured the right way. But you also relate to that, find misaligned incentives. Marketing is incented by how many quote-unquote new prospects get fit into a quote-unquote marketing funnel. And all the way up the chain, from the lowest position to the highest position in marketing, is myopically focused on that. And they think what they're really, that they're serving is in some way, shape, or form sales. But depending, even in purely digital businesses like the ones you and I have grown up in, there still is an operational supply component. And I think, an overused expression, but breaking down of those silos, and more importantly, taking a more enlightened view of saying, hey, we're actually looking at two sides of the same coin. The problem is we're not doing it collaboratively. So, this is really problematic. We don't start finding kind of a more holistic view of this and solving the issue. And I do think part of it's organizational, part of it is a interoperable, data set, kind of how do we line this up? I think at the end of the day, the idea of a demand chain, a supply chain is starting to converge. And I think what we're realizing is these are inextricably intertwined, and particularly in an era where we're going to see these demand distortion events. Whether it's Netflix with a huge surprise, or the auto industry where demand lifted the highest rate they've seen in, I don't know, 60 or 70 years since there wasn't a car in every driveway.
Yeah.
Neither seem to have seen these things happen. One was a downward draft, the other was an upward draft. So long way of saying, I think we're starting to see, and we'll continue to see, a complete reimagination. Just what we're seeing on the vendor, where there's unique partnerships, there's different titles and organizational structures, very clearly different way of engaging and working with customers. I think you're making the clarion call, Bob, that the enterprise needs to really start to rethink this, because you can't sit back and kind of watch this play out. I think you've got to take a different approach. The one last kind of related point I would make: the interview that you did with the chief information officer of Goya Foods, in my mind, was a good example of a company. Again, not a new industry. Lots of supply and demand complexity around it, and I thought just a great example of trying to break down some of those silos, use technology as a way to accelerate the business, certainly, but also quite a bit of change within that 100+ year organization, and a lot of it organizational and structural.
Yeah. So, Tony, I sure agree. And, if I could add one thing to a couple of great points that you've made here, right? I love that term from Lu Yi Yang about demand distortion. So if you pick up, somebody that you had mentioned before, Julia White, the Chief Marketing and Solution Officer at SAP, a couple months ago at SAP's Sapphire event, she told this great story of a fictional apparel company, Trilogy Jeans. And in the story that she told, Tony, which was really one of uniting supply and demand chains, I don't think she used this term, but Trilogy was creating the demand distortion event. They were going to launch a new branded jeans, and they wanted to really make sure that it came out with a big roar. They got all the influencers and social media and cranking it up that way. So there are sometimes companies create the demand
interesting
distortion. And if they are not also fully interconnected with the operations side, it'd be like, oh, well, why didn't somebody tell us about this? We didn't really get the production or the logistics or the delivery and the pricing and the training, all of that. So Tony, it's really there. May I please, as a closer, tell you a Larry Ellison story?
Please.
Well, I think it does. It kind of ties in with this. In my head, it does. I'm not sure it does, but it is a good story. So 10 or 12 years ago, he had the Oracle racing team and chasing the America's Cup, and they had lost a heartbreaker. And he was pretty well bound and determined that in 2013 or 14, I can't remember, he said, I'm tired of losing. He said, we're going to do something different. He had all the design, everybody in the whole racing organization in for a couple meetings, said, I want new ideas, I want new approaches, I want this. So let's reconvene in 2 weeks. So they came back, a few people talking about things. And one guy gets up and he says, well, I found out about this really interesting new type of sail. He said, it's called a fixed wing sail, like an airplane wing. And Larry's head sort of picked up and he said, what's it like? The guy said, oh, it's fast as hell, but it's impossible to control. It's very dangerous.
Yeah.
Larry says, go build one. So the guys come back and he's right away. First thing, how did that go? He said, it's fast, but it's impossible to control and it's unruly and this and that. I said, go build one, 50 feet tall. So they're all sort of, worrying about this, but they go out and they create one. How was it? Oh, it's great, fast as hell, but it's difficult. And he said, okay, go create one 100 feet tall. He said, but Larry, nobody's ever created one that big. And he said, that's the point. He said, we'll have one and they won't. And I think, Tony, in some ways, we see organizations and this part does this and this one does this. And you want to just shake and say, aren't we all united in this one thing to have something that nobody else has? So did that fit? Was that germane?
It fit beautifully, and I will hold for now, but please at a later date, next episode perhaps, I will tell the story of going on, at the time it was Larry Ellison's yacht. I believe he since sold it to David Geffen, and it's called the Rising Sun. And that was a whole different experience. But hey, all kidding aside, I think your point's really an interesting one. And I think, you and I have seen over the years these moments where there's a step change in the capabilities of technology. And oftentimes when that happens, it's not incremental in terms of the impact. You look back and you realize it was almost exponential, but these aren't linear. These things happen and then plateau and then they happen. We're clearly in one of those step changes right now. And I think that clarion call for really reimagining. Let's build a 100-foot sail, fixed wing sail. And, I think the reimagination of what you can do in business and through the use of some of these really remarkable technologies that, by the way, are within the grasp of almost any size company today. I mean, that's really what the fascinating nature of the scalability of a lot of the cloud-based tools and infrastructures is just so remarkable. But I do think it puts the pressure on C-level executives inside companies. I'm not talking about the tech companies for a minute. I think it puts a lot of pressure on, hey, if you take the governor off, if you take the limits off, what could you do? And I think you're probably seeing, various industries. It's the old third, and a third, Bob. I don't know if you ever heard this, but oftentimes when you come in to talk to an organization and you're really looking at some change, there's a third of the people that lean forward and is like, I've been waiting for somebody to walk through the door and be like this. There's a third of the people that are kind of like, I'm not sure. And there's a third that clearly aren't into it. And, you focus on the 2/3 and don't focus on the third. But I think there's really an interesting time and perhaps a unique opportunity for a lot of companies to really start to reimagine their role in that industry, because the industry is going through a massive digital transformation and it's creating new capabilities. But make no mistake about it, it's also creating new competitors. If I was a lumbering, and there are a lot of them out there, inefficient healthcare organization, and Oracle buys Cerner and Amazon steps in through acquisition, I think I'd be kind of, I got to think about it. As you and I talked before too, we haven't yet heard from Apple when we start to think about some of these vertical markets. And, I don't think the electric vehicle market is going to be just Tesla and then the other folks for much longer. I think you're going to see some of these companies like Apple step into these industries in a very visceral way and talk about co-opetition. I think there's going to be some fascinating dynamics play out there as well.
Well, Tony, that's fantastic. And I think maybe, so next episode or some future episode, we got to get into your Rising Sun story. Want to hear about that. And also, I really like, your point about what happens if you take the governors off. Let's dig into that at some point, because I know one of the things that I really admired that Google Cloud has done in the past year, they introduced a big new data management, almost like strategy and set of products way to look at things, and they just call it unlimited, right? So they're pushing that idea out there, right? And I think that would be a fascinating, next topic for us to muse on.
I look forward to it, my friend. Thank you very much. It's great to see you, and I look forward to next episode.
And Tony, any chance on one of these two? Maybe you'd strum a little guitar for us?
I spent some time this weekend restringing a couple of the guitars. Now, by the way, let me be very clear. That doesn't mean I know how to play them. I do know how to restring them, though. So it's a step in the right direction. So listen, if we get a popular vote from viewers, if there's enough out there, I'd have to pre-tape it. Because,
we'll
on
work
the
on
spot, I might not be able to conjure up a great virtuoso performance.
Well, Tony, thanks a million. This is wonderful. And folks, thanks to all of you for being with us here at Cloud Wars Live. We will be back next month. And Tony, I think, is going to do his guitar, probably play for about 15, 20 minutes. We'll take requests. So, send in early, send in often. No pressure, pal. Tony, we'll see you.
Thanks,
everybody.